A silent hospital room bathed in dawn's pale light. A 53-year-old police veteran lies motionless in his bed, medical reports scattered across the table beside him. Doctors have given him 3 months to live, the cancer spreading relentlessly. Through his body undetected for years. His situation is hopeless, his future already written, until the unexpected scratch at his door breaks the silence. A German shepherd police dog appears, his intelligent eyes fixed on the man with inexplicable purpose. What happens next defies medical explanation and will leave you speechless. Stay with us as we reveal the extraordinary story of Sergeant James Callahan, a decorated K-9 officer whose life was saved not by doctors, but by his partner, Shadow, a dog who sensed what million-dollar machines could not. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had dawned crisp and clear over the small town of Millfield. Sunlight spilled through half-drawn blinds, casting long shadows across Sergeant James Callahan's living room as he laced up his running shoes. At 53, his body might have slowed from his younger days, but his dedication to the morning run remained. Unwavering, 23 years on the force had taught him discipline above all else. "Come on, boy," he called to Shadow, his German shepherd partner of 6 years. The dog immediately appeared from the kitchen, tail wagging, dark, intelligent. Eyes already alert, despite the early hour. James smiled as he attached the leash. Shadow wasn't just any police dog. He was the department's most decorated K-9 officer, with dozens of successful drug busts and 3 life-saving rescues to his credit. "Just a quick 5 miles today," James said, scratching behind Shadow's pointed ears. "Chief wants us in early for that school demonstration." The crisp autumn air filled his lungs as they set out along their usual route through Oak Ridge Park. James had noticed he was getting winded more easily these past few weeks, but he attributed it to age and the changing seasons. Nothing that more training couldn't fix. 2 miles in, he paused at the crest of a small hill, taking a moment to catch his breath. Shadow, usually tugging eagerly ahead, stopped too. The dog turned to look back at his handler, head tilted in an expression James had come to recognize as concern. "I'm fine, boy," James assured him, straightening up. "Just need to push through it." But something was different today. Instead of continuing forward, Shadow circled back and pressed his nose firmly against James's lower abdomen, just above his right hip. Then he sat, looking up at James with unusual intensity. "What is it? You smell something." James looked down, perplexed. Shadow had been trained to alert to drugs, explosives, and missing persons, not to his handler's body. Shadow whined softly, then pressed his nose against the same spot again, more insistently this time. All right, James chuckled, gently pushing the dog away. "We'll get going." But Shadow wouldn't move. He planted himself firmly in the middle of the path, blocking James from continuing their run. His behavior was so unusual that James actually checked the area for threats. Perhaps Shadow had detected something dangerous nearby. The park was peaceful, barely stirring in the early morning light. No visible threats, no other people, nothing to explain Shadow's sudden fixation. "Shadow, heel," James commanded, using their formal training voice. The dog hesitated, which he never did, then reluctantly resumed their run, glancing back repeatedly at James, with unmistakable worry in his eyes. Chief Margaret Wilson looked up from her desk when James entered the station an hour later, Shadow trotting obediently at his side. "You look a bit pale, Callahan," she observed, setting down the report she'd been reviewing. "Everything okay?" "Fine, Chief," James replied, automatically straightening his posture. "Just pushed a bit hard on the run this morning." The truth was, he didn't feel fine. The unusual fatigue had been joined by a dull ache in his side, precisely where Shadow had been nosing at him earlier. Probably just a pulled muscle, he reasoned. Nothing that would interfere with today's duties. "The elementary school kids are going to love your demonstration," Chief Wilson said, smiling at Shadow. "Our star K9 officer always steals the show." James nodded, pushing away his discomfort. "We're ready. I've got the training aids in the cruiser." The demonstration at Millfield Elementary went perfectly, with Shadow showing off his obedience training, search abilities, and even a few crowd-pleasing tricks. The children were delighted, especially when allowed to pet the normally serious police dog at the end of the session. But throughout the demonstration, James noticed Shadow repeatedly looking at him with unusual vigilance, particularly when the pain in his side flared. Twice, when James was speaking to the children, Shadow broke position to press against his right side, behavior so abnormal that James had to smoothly incorporate it into the demonstration as a special bond between handler and dog. That evening, as James prepared dinner in his kitchen, the pain intensified enough that he had to grip the counter for support. Shadow, who had been watching from his bed in the corner, immediately rushed to his side, whining urgently. "It's nothing, boy," James muttered, though now he was starting to worry. The pain had a deep, insistent quality, unlike any muscle strain he'd experienced before. Shadow wasn't convinced. The dog circled him anxiously, then did something he'd never done before. He gently took James's wrist in his mouth and tugged, trying to lead him toward the front door. "What has gotten into you today?" James asked, freeing his wrist. But when he tried to return to cooking, Shadow barked sharply, something he never did indoors unless commanded. The dog's behavior was so peculiar that James finally gave in. "Okay, message received. I'll call Dr. Patel tomorrow if I'm not feeling better." "Happy now?" Shadow sat down, still watching him intently. That night, the pain woke James from a fitful sleep. He found Shadow already alert, standing beside his bed, eyes fixed on him in the darkness. When James struggled to sit up, Shadow immediately darted to the nightstand where James kept his phone. "You're really pushing this, aren't you?" James murmured, but the dog's intensity was unsettling. Reluctantly, he called the 24-hour nurse line, described his symptoms, and was advised to come to the emergency room if the pain continued to worsen. By morning, James could barely stand upright. Shadow refused to leave his side, even for going. His breakfast, unheard of for the disciplined working dog. When James finally decided to drive himself to the hospital, Shadow practically pushed him toward the car. The emergency room was busy, but a nurse quickly took James's vitals and medical history. Shadow caused a brief stir. Service animals were allowed, but police dogs were a rarity in the ER. But James couldn't bear to leave him at home, not with how strangely insistent the dog had been. "Probably kidney stones," the young ER doctor said after a preliminary examination. "Let's get an ultrasound to confirm." James nodded, relieved to have a likely explanation for the pain. Shadow, however, remained agitated, pacing as much as his leash would allow. The ultrasound technician arrived, a kind-faced woman named Elaine, who immediately took a shine to Shadow. "He's beautiful," she said, preparing the equipment. "How long have you two been partners?" 6 years, James replied, wincing as he shifted on the examination table. Best partner I've ever had. Elaine smiled and began the ultrasound, moving the wand methodically across James's abdomen. Her expression remained professional, but James noticed a subtle change when she reached his right side. A slight furrow of her brow, a more deliberate movement of the wand. I'm going to get the doctor to take a look at these images. She said carefully, sit tight for a few minutes. As she left, Shadow moved closer to the bed, resting his head on James's leg. The dog's eyes seemed to hold a knowledge that sent a chill down James's spine. The doctor returned with Elaine and another older physician he introduced as Dr. Renner, the chief of radiology. Sergeant Callahan, Dr. Renner began, his voice measured. We found something concerning on your ultrasound. There's a mass on your right kidney that requires immediate attention. We need to run more comprehensive tests, a CT scan and blood work, right away. James felt the room tilt slightly. A mass? You mean? We can't confirm anything without further testing, Dr. Renner said carefully. But yes, we're concerned it could be renal cell carcinoma, kidney cancer. Shadow whined softly, pressing closer to James. But that's impossible, James protested, weakly. I just had my department physical 3 months ago. Everything was clear. Dr. Renner nodded sympathetically. Unfortunately, some cancers don't present obvious symptoms until they're quite advanced. Your physical likely wouldn't have caught this without specific kidney imaging, which isn't standard in routine examinations. The next few hours passed in a blur of tests, questions, and growing dread. The CT scan confirmed the radiologist's suspicions. A large tumor on James's right kidney, with evidence suggesting it had already begun to spread to nearby lymph nodes. By evening, James found himself admitted to the oncology ward, Shadow remarkably allowed to stay at his side thanks to Chief Wilson's intervention with hospital administration. The diagnosis had been delivered with clinical precision. Stage 3 renal cell carcinoma, aggressive and fast-growing. Given the size and position of the tumor and the lymphatic involvement, the oncologist had explained, we're looking at immediate surgery followed by targeted therapy. The prognosis is, she had hesitated, challenging. Perhaps 3 to 6 months without treatment, with aggressive intervention, potentially a year or more. James had listened in stunned silence, trying to process how his life had shattered so completely in less than 24 hours. Just yesterday he had been running 5 miles, demonstrating police techniques to school children, planning for next month's department fishing trip. Now, he was staring down a death sentence. As night fell over the hospital, James lay awake, the reality of his situation crushing down on him. Shadow remained vigilant beside the bed, having refused food and water from the kind nurses who had brought bowls for him. You knew, didn't you? James whispered, reaching down to stroke the dog's head. Somehow you knew before anyone else. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and the dog gently placed his paw on James's arm. The simple gesture broke something in the stoic police veteran, and for the first time since receiving the diagnosis, he allowed tears to come. Chief Wilson visited early the next morning, her usual commanding presence softened by concern. The department is behind you 100%, James, she assured him, standing at his bedside. Whatever you need, medical leave, insurance paperwork, anything. James nodded gratefully. Thanks, Chief, it's all happening so fast. The surgeon wants to operate tomorrow, she said. I've already arranged for someone to look after Shadow while you're in recovery." At the mention of his name, Shadow raised his head from where he lay beside the bed. James shook his head. "No need. Sarah can take him." Sarah Callahan, James's daughter who lived across town, had already called in tears after hearing the news. "She'll bring him to visit. The doctors say I'll need at least a week here after surgery." Chief Wilson looked skeptical. "Are you sure? Shadow's a working dog. He's used to a routine training. Sarah has her hands full with those twins of hers." "He'll be fine," James insisted, though the thought of being separated from Shadow created a hollow feeling in his chest. "It's just temporary." But when Sarah arrived that afternoon to take Shadow home with her, the dog refused to move. He planted himself firmly beside James's bed, ignoring commands from both his handler and Sarah. "Dad, I've never seen him like this," Sarah said, perplexed after 10 minutes of failed coaxing. "He won't even take a treat from me." James was equally baffled. Shadow had always been exceptionally well trained, responding instantly to commands. This level of disobedience was unprecedented. "Shadow, go," James said firmly, pointing toward Sarah. "Go with Sarah now." The German shepherd looked at him with such sorrowful understanding that James felt a lump form in his throat. Then, deliberately, Shadow lay down on the floor beside the bed, his body pressed against the frame, and refused to move. A nurse who had been watching from the doorway stepped into the room. "You know," she said hesitantly, "I've worked in oncology for 15 years. Sometimes we bend the rules a bit when it really matters. If your dog remains calm and doesn't disturb the other patients, I don't see why he can't stay." "But the surgery tomorrow," James began. "We'll figure something out," the nurse assured him. "Not the first time we've dealt with a devoted companion who refuses to leave." That night, as James tried to sleep despite his fears about the next day's surgery, he felt Shadow's warmth against the side of the bed. Despite everything, the diagnosis, the pain, the uncertain future, there was comfort in the dog's unwavering presence. "Whatever happens," James whispered in the darkness, "thank you for finding it, for making me go to the hospital." Shadow's tail thumped softly against the floor, a quiet acknowledgement of words he couldn't understand but somehow seemed to feel. When the surgical team arrived to take James to the operating room the next morning, they faced an unexpected challenge. Shadow refused to be separated from his handler, growling softly, not aggressively, but with clear intent, when an orderly tried to lead him away. "This is unprecedented," the head surgeon, Dr. Melissa Chen, said with a frown. "The dog absolutely cannot be in the operating room." James tried once more to command Shadow to go with Sarah, who had returned to take him home, but the dog remained immovable, his eyes never leaving James's face. "Wait," said a voice from the doorway. A tall man with salt and pepper hair and a thoughtful expression stepped into the room. "I might have a solution." He introduced himself as Dr. Robert Keller, the hospital's chief of oncology. "I was reviewing your case last night, Sergeant Callahan. It's quite remarkable how your dog detected your cancer before our medical equipment did." "He's a trained detection dog," James explained, wincing as he shifted position. "Not for cancer." "Of course, but for narcotics and people," Dr. Keller nodded, studying Shadow with evident fascination. "There's actually growing research about dogs sensing cancer through volatile organic compounds, essentially molecular signatures that cancer cells release. Some medical centers are even training dogs specifically for cancer detection." Turned to Dr. Chen. I have a proposal. Let the dog stay in the pre-op area until Sergeant Callahan is under anesthesia. Then your daughter can take him home. This might ease the transition." Dr. Chen looked skeptical, but finally agreed. To everyone's surprise, Shadow seemed to understand the compromise. He remained calm as James was wheeled toward the surgical suite, following quietly alongside until they reached the pre-op area. There he sat obediently while the anesthesiologist prepared James for surgery. "I'll see you soon, boy," James murmured as the drugs began to take effect. The last thing he saw before losing consciousness was Shadow's attentive face, those intelligent eyes watching over him with unwavering loyalty. The surgery lasted 7 hours, longer than anticipated. The tumor had infiltrated surrounding tissues more extensively than the imaging had suggested. Dr. Chen and her team performed a radical nephrectomy, removing James's entire right kidney along with nearby affected lymph nodes. When James finally woke in the recovery room, groggy and in considerable pain, his first coherent thought was of Shadow. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry from the breathing tube they had just removed. "Easy," a nurse soothed, offering him ice chips. "The surgery went as well as could be expected. Dr. Chen will explain everything once you're more alert." James managed to croak out one word. "Shadow?" The nurse smiled. "Your daughter took him home. He didn't want to go, but eventually he relented." She hesitated, then added, "The strangest thing happened, though. Right before they led him away, he started acting agitated again, trying to approach another patient who was waiting for transport. Security had to help remove him." James frowned, trying to process this information through the fog of post-anesthesia and pain medication. It wasn't like Shadow to be disruptive. The following days were a blur of pain management, medical consultations, and gradual recovery. Sarah brought Shadow to visit daily, and the dog's demeanor was a reliable indicator of James's progress. Calmer on better days, anxious when James was struggling with pain or nausea from the medications. On the 4th day after surgery, Dr. Chen and Dr. Keller came to discuss his prognosis. "We removed the entire tumor," Dr. Chen explained, "but as we suspected, it had already spread to several lymph nodes. The pathology confirms it's an aggressive form of renal cell carcinoma." James nodded, having prepared himself for bad news. "What's next?" "We recommend starting targeted therapy as soon as you've recovered sufficiently from surgery," Dr. Keller said. "There are several new drugs that have shown promising results in cases like yours." "And my chances?" James asked directly. The doctors exchanged glances. "With treatment, patients with your staging and overall health might expect 12 to 18 months, Dr. Keller said carefully. "Some outliers do better, of course." James absorbed this information with the stoicism that had carried him through 2 decades of police work. A year, maybe a little more. Enough time to put his affairs in order, to spend time with Sarah and his grandchildren, to ensure Shadow would be cared for after he was gone. "I understand," he said simply. That evening, when Sarah brought Shadow for his visit, James noticed the dog seemed distracted, repeatedly looking toward the door and down the hallway. "What's gotten into him?" Sarah asked, as Shadow whined softly, his attention clearly elsewhere despite James's presence. "Not sure," James replied. "The nurse mentioned he acted strangely right after my surgery too." When a hospital volunteer appeared at the door with a food cart, Shadow suddenly lunged forward, pulling his leash from Sarah's hand. Instead of running out the door, however, he stood in the doorway, barking once and looking back at James and Sarah as if expecting them to follow. "Shadow, no!" Sarah called, embarrassed by the normally well-behaved dog's outburst. "I'm so sorry," she apologized to the startled volunteer, but James was watching Shadow with growing curiosity. "Wait," he said, slowly swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "I think he wants us to follow him." "Dad, you shouldn't be getting up without assistance," Sarah protested. But James was already carefully standing, grimacing at the pull of his surgical incision. "Just to the door," he insisted. "Something's bothering him." When James reached the doorway, Shadow immediately moved into the hallway, looking back expectantly. The dog walked a few paces, then stopped, clearly waiting for them to follow. "This is crazy," Sarah muttered, but she supported her father as they slowly made their way after Shadow. The German Shepherd led them purposefully down the corridor, past the nurse's station, where several staff members watched in bewilderment, and toward another patient's room. He stopped outside room 418, sitting down firmly and looking up at James. "He wants us to go in there," Sarah whispered, confused. James looked through the partially open door. An elderly man lay in the hospital bed, apparently asleep. A younger woman, perhaps his daughter, sat beside him, reading quietly. "We can't just go into a stranger's room," James said, turning to lead Shadow away. But at that moment, the woman looked up and noticed them standing there. Her eyes widened at the sight of the German Shepherd. "I'm so sorry," James began to apologize. "My dog just—" "Is that a police dog?" the woman interrupted, rising from her chair. James nodded. "Yes, my K9 partner. I apologize for the disturbance." To his surprise, the woman came to the door, her expression intense. "Yesterday, a police dog tried to come into my father's room. The handlers pulled him away." She looked down at Shadow, who remained sitting attentively. "It looked just like this one." James and Sarah exchanged glances. "That was probably Shadow," James confirmed. "I was in surgery, and apparently he caused some trouble before leaving with my daughter." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she said suddenly, could he come in for a moment?" Bewildered, James nodded, and they followed her into the room. Shadow immediately approached the bed, his nose raised, sniffing intently at the sleeping man's midsection. "Dad," the woman said, gently waking the elderly patient. "Dad, the dog is here again." The man stirred, opening rheumy eyes. He looked first at his daughter, then at the strange trio who had entered his room. His gaze settled on Shadow, who was now actively sniffing around his left side. "What's this about, Karen?" he asked, his voice weak. "This is the dog I told you about, Dad," Karen explained. "The one that got so agitated outside your room yesterday." She turned to James. "My father was admitted for pneumonia 3 days ago. They've treated it, but he's not improving as quickly as expected. After that police dog incident yesterday, I remembered reading something about dogs detecting illness. I mentioned it to his doctor this morning, but they said without specific symptoms." James looked down at Shadow, who was now sitting beside the man's bed, staring intently at his left side, exhibiting the exact same behavior he had shown with James before his diagnosis. "Sir," James said, addressing the elderly patient, "I know, this sounds strange, but my dog detected my kidney cancer before any medical tests. He's the reason I came to the hospital in the first place." The old man's eyes widened slightly. "Cancer? You think—" "I don't know," James admitted. "But in my case, Shadow kept focusing on the exact spot where the tumor was located." Karen immediately pressed the call button. When a nurse appeared, she explained the situation with increasing urgency. The nurse looked skeptical, but promised to speak with the attending physician. Dr. Keller arrived 20 minutes later, having been paged by the curious attending physician. He listened to the story with growing interest, watching as Shadow maintained his focused attention on the elderly patient's left side. "Mr. Pearson," Dr. Keller addressed the old man, "with your permission, I'd like to order some additional tests. An ultrasound to start with." "Because of a dog?" another doctor asked incredulously from the doorway. "Because we have unexplained symptoms and a potentially valuable diagnostic indicator," Dr. Keller replied firmly. "And yes, because this particular dog has already proven his ability to detect at least one cancer that our standard protocols missed." 2 hours later, Mr. Pearson was wheeled away for an ultrasound of his abdomen, followed by a CT scan when the initial imaging revealed a shadow on his pancreas. By evening, the results confirmed what Shadow had somehow already known: pancreatic cancer, a type notoriously difficult to detect in early stages. The pneumonia was likely his body's response to the underlying cancer, Dr. Keller explained to Karen in James's presence, having obtained permission from Mr. Pearson to share the information. "It's actually fortunate we found this now. Pancreatic cancer is often not diagnosed until it's too late for any intervention." Karen's eyes filled with tears. "And we only found it because of your dog." She turned to James. "How can I ever thank you?" James shook his head. "Thanks, Shadow. I'm just along for the ride." That night, as James rested in his hospital bed with Shadow once again permitted to stay at his side, he found himself contemplating the extraordinary turn of events. His own diagnosis remained grim, but somehow Shadow had now given another family the gift of early detection, a chance they might not otherwise have had. "What other secrets are you keeping, boy?" he murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. German Shepherd simply looked up at him with those knowing eyes that seemed to hold more understanding than any animal should possess. The next morning, Dr. Keller arrived with an unusual request. "The hospital administration has been discussing yesterday's events," he explained. "They've asked if you and Shadow would be willing to participate in a small observational study once you're further along in your recovery." "What kind of study?" James asked. "Nothing invasive," Dr. Keller assured him, "just allowing Shadow to visit certain areas of the oncology ward under controlled conditions. We document his responses to patients and follow up with testing when appropriate." He paused. "There's growing scientific interest in canine's ability to detect cancer through scent. Your partner here could potentially help advance this research significantly." James considered the request. His medical leave would be extensive, and the prognosis still weighed heavily on him. But the thought of Shadow's remarkable ability helping others gave him a sense of purpose he desperately needed. "We'd need to clear it with the department," he said finally. "Shadow is technically police property." "Of course," Dr. Keller nodded. "We've already reached out to Chief Wilson. She seemed quite supportive of the idea, pending your agreement." 2 days later, James was discharged from the hospital with a treatment plan, medication regimen, and follow-up appointments scheduled. As Sarah helped him into her car with Shadow watching attentively from the back seat, he found himself contemplating the strange twist his life had taken. A month ago, he had been a healthy police sergeant, looking forward to a few more years on the force before retirement. Now he was facing a terminal diagnosis, unlikely to see another Christmas. Yet alongside this devastating reality, Something remarkable had emerged. His partner's extraordinary ability had already saved one life, and might potentially save more. During his first week at home, James focused on regaining his strength, while adjusting to his new medications. Shadow rarely left his side, always vigilant, always watching. Sarah visited daily, often bringing her twin boys, who delighted in playing gentle games with the now famous police dog. "The department's been calling," Sarah mentioned one evening as she prepared dinner in James's kitchen. "They want to know when you'll be up for visitors. Apparently there's been quite a bit of media interest in Shadow's story." James looked over at his partner, who was lying contently by his feet. "What do you think, boy? Ready to be famous?" Shadow's tail thumped against the floor, his expression as serious and dedicated as ever. 9 days after his discharge, James received a visit from Chief Wilson and Dr. Keller, who came with unexpected news. "The hospital board has fast-tracked approval for our canine detection study," Dr. Keller explained, sitting across from James in his living room. "We've already had inquiries from 2 major research institutions wanting to collaborate." Chief Wilson nodded. "And the department is fully on board. We're preparing a special assignment designation for Shadow, the first of its kind. You'll both remain on the force, but with a new mission." James was surprised by the speed of these developments. "I'm still recovering," he reminded them, "and my long-term prognosis hasn't changed." "We understand," Dr. Keller said gently. "The program will accommodate your treatment schedule and physical limitations. But having witnessed Shadow's abilities firsthand, we believe this work is too important to delay." "There's something else," Chief Wilson added, exchanging glances with Dr. Keller. "Mr. Pearson, the gentleman Shadow diagnosed in the hospital, his cancer was caught at stage 1. The oncology team believes it's completely treatable with surgery." James felt a complex wave of emotions wash over him. Gratitude that Mr. Pearson had a fighting chance, pride in Shadow's remarkable abilities, and yes, a touch of bitterness that his own cancer had been detected too late for such optimism. "That's wonderful news," he said sincerely, reaching down to stroke Shadow's head, "and all because this guy wouldn't take no for an answer." As Chief Wilson and Dr. Keller outlined their plans for the program, James found himself looking at Shadow with new appreciation. The bond between handler and dog had always been strong, built on years of training and field work. But now he understood it was something deeper, something science was only beginning to comprehend. Shadow had not only detected his cancer, but had refused to abandon him in his time of need, had somehow communicated the urgency when no one else noticed anything wrong, and had even extended his gift to help another patient. "So what do you say, Sergeant?" Chief Wilson asked. "Are you and Shadow willing to pioneer this new assignment?" James looked down at his partner, who gazed back with unwavering loyalty and what seemed like anticipation, as if he already understood the importance of what they were being asked to do. "We're in," James said decisively. "For as long as I'm able." That night, as James sat on his back porch watching the sunset with Shadow at his feet, he contemplated the uncertain road ahead. The cancer treatments would be grueling, the prognosis unchanged, but somehow the despair that had initially consumed him had been replaced by something unexpected. Purpose. His remaining time, whether months or years, would have meaning beyond his own struggle. "You've always been one step ahead of me, haven't you?" he murmured to Shadow, who perked his ears at the sound of his voice. "Saving lives was always your specialty. I just didn't realize you'd end up saving them in a hospital instead of on the streets." Shadow rested his head on James's knee, those intelligent eyes seeming to communicate understanding beyond words. 2 weeks later, James found himself sitting in a conference room at Millfield Memorial Hospital, Shadow lying calmly at his feet. Around the table sat an impressive assembly, Dr. Keller and 2 other oncologists from the hospital. Dr. Elaine Morrison, a renowned researcher in biomedical detection from the University Medical Center, Chief Wilson, and a hospital administrator who had initially opposed the program but now seemed cautiously intrigued. The protocols are established. Dr. Morrison was explaining, sliding documents across the table. Shadow will visit pre-selected patients who have given informed consent. His reactions will be documented by 2 observers, 1 medical professional and 1 canine handling expert. She turned to James. Sergeant Callahan, you'll need to interpret Shadow's alerts based on your experience as his handler, but you'll be blind to the patient's medical histories to prevent any unconscious cueing. James nodded, reviewing the paperwork. His strength was gradually returning, though the surgical incision still pulled uncomfortably when he moved too quickly. The first round of targeted therapy had left him fatigued and nauseated, but he'd pushed through it, determined to get the program running. What about Shadow's training schedule? Chief Wilson asked. He still needs to maintain his police certification. We've worked out a modified schedule, James assured her. 3 days a week at the hospital, 2 days for regular K9 training. Exercises that I can supervise without physical strain. Officer Martinez has agreed to handle the more demanding aspects. Dr. Keller leaned forward. I want to emphasize that we're approaching this scientifically. While Mr. Pearson's case was remarkable, we need controlled studies to determine Shadow's accuracy, what types of cancer he can detect, and at what stages. And you're sure this won't interfere with your treatment, Sergeant? The hospital administrator asked, concern evident in her voice. My treatment is part of why this is possible, James replied simply. I'm here anyway. Might as well put our time to good use. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval to begin the program the following week. As the participants gathered their materials, Dr. Morrison approached James and Shadow. I've studied cancer-detecting dogs for 7 years now, she said, kneeling to examine Shadow more closely. The scientific literature suggests they can identify cancer with accuracy between 90 and 95%, better than many of our current screening methods for certain cancers. She looked up at James, but I've never encountered a case where a working dog with no cancer detection training spontaneously alerted to his handler's condition. It's fascinating. Shadow's always been exceptional, James said proudly. Top of his training class, highest success rate in field operations. Perhaps, Dr. Morrison mused, but I suspect there's more to it than training excellence. The bond between you might be amplifying his natural abilities. She straightened up. I'm looking forward to working with both of you. As James drove home with Shadow in the specially modified rear compartment of his SUV, he contemplated the strange new chapter that had opened in their partnership. His life had been defined by law enforcement for so long that this medical role felt foreign yet somehow right. His phone rang, Sarah's name flashing on the screen. He activated the hands-free system. Hey, sweetheart. Dad, how did the meeting go? Her voice carried that careful cheerfulness she'd adopted since his diagnosis, the deliberate optimism that sometimes broke his heart. Green light across the board. We start next Tuesday. That's wonderful. Her enthusiasm sounded genuine. The boys are so proud. They've been telling everyone at school that their grandpa's dog is going to help doctors find cancer. James smiled, despite himself. Well, we'll see. It's a research program, not a miracle. Seems pretty miraculous to me, Sarah countered softly. If it wasn't for Shadow... She left the thought unfinished, but James understood. Without Shadow's persistent alerting, his cancer might have remained undetected for weeks or months longer, until symptoms became impossible to ignore. By then, even the limited options he now faced would have been closed to him. "How are you feeling?" she asked, changing subjects when he didn't respond. "Any better after the last treatment?" "Some days are better than others," he admitted. "Today's not bad." He didn't mention the deep fatigue that had settled into his bones, or the way food had lost its taste, or how he sometimes woke in the night with a sense of panic so profound it left him gasping. Sarah carried enough worry already. The boys and... "I will bring dinner tomorrow," she promised. "Mom's lasagna recipe, your favorite." After ending the call, James glanced in the rearview mirror at Shadow, who was watching him intently from the back seat. "Looks like we're celebrities now, partner," he said. Shadow's ears perked up at his voice. "Don't let it go to your head." The weekend passed quietly as James rested and prepared for their new assignment. On Monday evening, however, an unexpected visitor arrived at his door. Gerald Pearson, the elderly man Shadow had diagnosed in the hospital, accompanied by his daughter, Karen. "Hope you don't mind us dropping by," Gerald said when James invited them in. "Karen tracked down your address through that doctor, Keller." "Not at all," James assured them, gesturing toward the living room. "Please, sit down. Can I offer you anything?" "We can't stay long," Karen explained, as her father settled carefully onto the couch. "Dad's still recovering from his surgery last week." Shadow had immediately approached Gerald, sniffing him thoroughly before sitting beside him. "Apparently satisfied with his inspection," Gerald smiled, tentatively patting the German shepherd's head. "The doctors got it all," he explained to James. "The tumor was contained, hadn't spread like they feared. Another month or two without detection, and it would have been a different story." Karen's eyes glistened with tears. "The oncologist said most pancreatic cancers are diagnosed at stage 4. By then, the 5-year survival rate is only about 3%. But they caught mine at stage 1, Gerald continued, a note of wonder in his voice. "Thanks to your dog. The surgeon was able to remove it completely." James felt a complex mixture of emotions, genuine happiness for Gerald, pride in Shadow, and, if he was honest, a pang of envy. His own cancer had already progressed too far for such optimism. "We wanted to thank you properly," Karen said, reaching into her purse and withdrawing an envelope. "We know no amount of money can really express our gratitude, but—" James raised his hand, stopping her. "That's very generous, but I can't accept payment. Shadow was just doing what comes naturally to him." "But we need to do something," Karen insisted. "You and Shadow saved my father's life." James considered for a moment, then said, "There is something you could do. The hospital is starting a research program to study Shadow's abilities. Would you be willing to share your story as part of that research? It might help others understand the potential of canine cancer detection." Gerald nodded immediately. "Of course, anything. And," James added, "if you're comfortable with it, your case might help secure additional funding for the program. The hospital administration is supportive but cautious about resources." "I'll call Dr. Keller tomorrow," Karen promised. She hesitated, then asked gently, "And how are you doing?" "With your own treatment," James offered a small smile. taking it day by day. The doctors are doing everything they can. After the Pearsons left, James sat on his back porch, Shadow resting at his feet. The summer evening was pleasant, fireflies beginning to dot the darkening yard. In the distance, a neighbor's wind chimes created a peaceful melody. "You've started something big, boy," he murmured to Shadow. "Bigger than either of us expected." Tuesday morning arrived with a sense of anticipation. James, dressed carefully, in civilian clothes rather than his uniform. Dr. Morrison had suggested that patients might feel more comfortable with a less authoritative presence. Still, he couldn't help straightening his posture and polishing Shadow's service collar to a shine, old habits from years of representing the department. Sarah drove them to the hospital, where Dr. Keller and Dr. Morrison were waiting in a small conference room near the oncology ward. "We've selected 5 patients for today," Dr. Morrison explained, handing James a clipboard. "They've all consented to participate. 3 have confirmed diagnoses of various cancers. 1 has a benign condition with similar symptoms, and 1 is a cancer survivor with no current disease." "A controlled test," James observed. "Exactly. We need to establish baseline measurements for Shadow's accuracy and whether he distinguishes between active cancer and cancer history." The first patient was a middle-aged woman sitting up in bed reading a magazine. Shadow followed James into the room, immediately beginning a methodical investigation, sniffing the air and then approaching the bed. James watched carefully. After a moment, Shadow moved to the woman's right side and sat down, looking up at James with the alert expression he'd come to recognize. "He's alerting," James said quietly to Dr. Morrison, who was observing from the doorway. The woman looked between them curiously. "What does that mean?" "It means he's detected something of interest," Dr. Morrison explained diplomatically. "Thank you for participating. We'll move on now." In the hallway, Dr. Morrison made notes on her clipboard. "Correct alert. Patient has stage 2 colorectal cancer, right-sided." The second patient, an elderly man, received only a cursory investigation from Shadow before the dog returned to James's side without alerting. "No alert," James confirmed. In the hallway, Dr. Morrison nodded. "Cancer survivor, 5 years in remission from prostate cancer. Interesting that he doesn't alert to cancer history." The third room contained a young woman barely out of her teens. Shadow became immediately agitated upon entering, circling the bed with unusual intensity before sitting directly in front of the girl, staring up at her with unwavering focus. "Strong alert," James noted, surprised by the intensity of Shadow's response. The young woman looked alarmed. "Is something wrong? The doctors said I just have severe anemia. That's why I'm here, is for transfusions and tests." Dr. Morrison exchanged glances with Dr. Keller, who had joined them for this patient. "Thank you for your participation," she said carefully. "We'll be moving on now." In the hallway, James looked questioningly at the doctors. "This is unexpected," Dr. Keller admitted quietly. "Emma Roberts has been admitted for severe unexplained anemia. We've run standard screenings, but no cancer diagnosis has been made." Shadow. "Seems very certain," James said, watching his partner, who kept looking back toward the girl's room. "We'll expedite some additional testing," Dr. Keller promised, making a note. "With her permission, of course." The fourth patient triggered no alert from Shadow, correctly identifying another non-cancer case. But the fifth patient, a middle-aged man who appeared to be sleeping, caused Shadow to alert strongly to the man's neck and upper chest area. "Confirmed thyroid cancer with lymph node involvement," Dr. Morrison noted afterward. "That's 4 out of 5 correct identifications, assuming the Roberts girl doesn't have an undiagnosed malignancy. That's 80% accuracy in a very small sample, Dr. Keller commented. Potentially 100% if follow-up confirms Shadow's alert on Ms. Roberts. By the end of the session, James was fatigued but encouraged. Shadow had performed with remarkable focus and precision, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the unfamiliar environment. "We'll continue with twice-weekly sessions," Dr. Morrison said as they debriefed in the conference room. "I'd like to gradually increase the number of patients and introduce more variables, different cancer types, stages, and locations." James nodded, absently massaging his side where pain had been gradually intensifying throughout the morning. Dr. Keller noticed the gesture. "How are you feeling, Sergeant? Is this too strenuous?" "I'm fine," James assured him automatically. "Just tired." But Dr. Keller wasn't easily deflected. "Your next treatment is scheduled for tomorrow, correct? Perhaps we should delay Thursday's session until next week." James wanted to protest, but found himself nodding in agreement. The targeted therapy treatments left him drained and nauseated for days afterward. As much as he wanted to push forward with the program, he needed to acknowledge his limitations. As they were preparing to leave, a nurse rushed into the conference room looking slightly flustered. "Dr. Keller, we've just received the rush blood work for Emma Roberts, the young woman in room 307. Dr. Keller took the clipboard, scanning the results with a deepening frown. "These markers," he murmured, then looked up sharply. "Order. A bone marrow biopsy immediately. And let's get oncology hematology consulted." After the nurse hurried away, Dr. Keller turned to James and Dr. Morrison. "The preliminary blood work shows abnormalities consistent with leukemia, a type that can be difficult to diagnose in its early stages because the symptoms mimic common conditions like anemia." Dr. Morrison looked at Shadow with newfound appreciation. "If confirmed, that would validate his alert. Remarkable. What are her chances?" James asked quietly, thinking of the young woman's frightened expression. "If it is leukemia and we've caught it early, her prognosis could be quite good with proper treatment," Dr. Keller assured him. "Young patients often respond well to therapy." On the drive home, with Sarah again behind the wheel, James found himself contemplating the day's events. Shadow had potentially identified a life-threatening condition that standard medical screenings had initially missed. Again. "You know what's strange?" he said to Sarah. "When I was diagnosed, I kept thinking about all the things I wouldn't get to do or see. But now I'm more focused on what Shadow and I can accomplish with whatever time I have left." Sarah glanced at him, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You always did work better with a mission, Dad." That evening, as James rested on the couch with Shadow beside him, the local news featured a brief segment about the new cancer detection program at Millfield Memorial. They showed footage of Shadow entering the hospital, filmed that morning by a local reporter who had been pre-approved to document the program's launch, a pioneering partnership between law enforcement and medicine, the reporter declared. "This dedicated K-9 officer has transitioned from detecting drugs to detecting disease, potentially saving lives in a whole new way." James muted the television as his phone rang. It was Dr. Keller. "Thought you'd want to know," the doctor said without preamble. "We've confirmed acute lymphoblastic leukemia in Emma Roberts. We're starting treatment protocols tomorrow. Thanks to early detection, her prognosis is significantly better than if we'd waited for more obvious symptoms to develop." After ending the call, James sat in silence, processing this news. Shadow, sensing his mood, placed his head on James's knee. "That's two, boy," James murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "Two lives you've helped save." He didn't count his own. His cancer had already progressed too far for optimal treatment outcomes. But still, Shadow had given him these extra months, this opportunity to create meaning from his diagnosis. The irony wasn't lost on him. Throughout his career, he had measured success by arrests made, crimes prevented, lives protected. Now, facing his own mortality, he found himself part of something that might ultimately save more lives than all his years in uniform. As he prepared for bed that night, James caught a glimpse of himself in the bathroom mirror. The changes were becoming more apparent: weight loss, a greyish undertone to his skin, the shadowed circles beneath his eyes. The cancer and its treatment were taking their toll. But there was something else in his reflection too, something that had been missing in those first dark days after his diagnosis: purpose. Shadow had given him that along with borrowed time. "Whatever happens," he said to his reflection, "we're going to make it count." The next 6 weeks established a rhythm to James's new life. Treatment days that left him drained and miserable. Recovery days spent mostly resting at home with Shadow vigilant beside him, and then the increasingly rewarding hospital sessions where Shadow's remarkable abilities continued to impress the medical team. By mid-August, the program had expanded considerably. What had begun as a small observational study now included collaborative research with the University Medical Center, dedicated hospital funding, and increasing media attention. Shadow had correctly identified cancer in 27 patients, including 3 cases where subsequent testing confirmed malignancies that had been previously undetected by conventional screening. "The consistency is remarkable," Dr. Morrison commented during their weekly review meeting. "Shadow demonstrates 96% accuracy across different cancer types and stages. He's particularly sensitive to pancreatic, lung, and thyroid cancers, types that are often diagnosed late." James nodded, trying to focus despite the fatigue and pain that had become his constant companions. The latest scans had revealed that despite aggressive treatment, his cancer was continuing to spread. Dr. Chen had gently suggested that it might be time to consider transitioning from curative to palliative approaches, focusing on quality of life rather than fighting for additional months that might be filled with suffering. He hadn't made that decision yet. The program had become his anchor, giving structure and meaning to days that might otherwise have been consumed by his declining health. "We've been invited to present preliminary findings at the National Oncology Conference in October," Dr. Keller announced, sliding a formal invitation across the table. "It's a tremendous opportunity to introduce the medical community to K9. Cancer detection's potential, October." James did the mental calculation. 8 weeks away. Would he still be well enough to participate? The uncertainty of his prognosis had become yet another burden to bear. "I'd like to attend," he said carefully, "but I can't make promises about my condition by then." Dr. Keller nodded, his expression compassionate. "We understand. The invitation specifically mentions your participation if health permits. Shadow would need to attend regardless. He's the star of the research after all." "We could prepare a video interview now," Dr. Morrison suggested tactfully. "That way, you'd be represented even if travel becomes difficult." James appreciated their sensitivity, the way they acknowledged his reality without pity. That makes sense. Let's schedule it for next week. After the meeting, James took Shadow for a short walk around the hospital's healing garden, a peaceful space designed for patients and visitors to find moments of tranquility. His strength wasn't what it once was. A simple stroll now required, the same exertion as a 5-mile run used to demand. But being outdoors with Shadow, watching his partner investigate the garden's interesting scents, brought a simple pleasure that cancer couldn't diminish. Sergeant Callahan? James turned to find Emma Roberts approaching hesitantly, a colorful scarf wrapped around her head. The young woman's leukemia treatment had progressed well, according to updates Dr. Keller occasionally shared. "Miss Roberts," he greeted her with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Better every day," she said, kneeling to greet Shadow, who immediately recognized her and wagged his tail in welcome. "The doctors say I'm responding really well to treatment. They're actually using the word remission now." "That's wonderful." "News?" Emma nodded, still petting Shadow. "My oncologist says that because we caught it early, before it had advanced too far, my long-term prognosis is excellent." She looked up at James, eyes bright with emotion. "I might not have had early detection without him." James watched as Shadow soaked up the attention, his usually dignified demeanor softening under Emma's appreciative petting. "He's pretty special." "I was hoping." Emma hesitated. "Would it be okay if I visit him sometimes? The nurses said you're usually here on Tuesdays and Thursdays." "Of course," James replied, touched by the request. "Shadow would like that." Emma smiled, then asked with careful delicacy, "And how are you doing with your treatment?" The question was becoming more difficult to answer honestly as time passed. James settled for a simplified truth, taking it one day at a time. When Emma left, promising to visit again the following week, James found a bench in the shade. The brief encounter had affected him more than he'd expected. Emma's cancer journey was heading toward recovery, a path his own would never take. Yet there was profound satisfaction in knowing Shadow had helped make her positive outcome possible. Back at home that evening, James received an unexpected call from Chief Wilson. "Just checking in," she said after exchanging pleasantries. "The department's been following the program's progress. Pretty impressive results." "Shadow's doing all the work," James replied modestly. "I'm just the translator." "That's not how Dr. Keller tells it. He says your ability to read Shadow's alerts is crucial to the program's success." She paused. "Actually, I'm calling about something specific. The mayor wants to present Shadow with a commendation for distinguished service at next month's city council meeting. First time it's been awarded to a K-9 officer." James felt a surge of pride. He deserves it. "The ceremony's scheduled for September 15th. Think you'll be up for it?" The unspoken question hung in the air. Would he still be well enough by then? Would he still be alive? "Put us on the calendar," James said with more confidence than he felt. "We'll be there." After ending the call, James sank deeper into his armchair, suddenly overwhelmed by exhaustion. Shadow immediately approached, resting his head on James's knee with a concerned whine. "I'm okay, boy," James assured him, though they both knew it wasn't true. The pain had been intensifying over the past week, requiring increased medication that left him foggy and disconnected. His appetite had diminished to almost nothing. The stairs to his bedroom had become an insurmountable challenge some evenings, forcing him to sleep on the couch. Shadow whined again, more insistently this time, then did something unusual. He gently took James's wrist in his mouth and tugged, just as he had done the night before James's initial hospital visit. "What is it?" James asked, suddenly alert. Was Shadow alerting to a new development in his condition? The German shepherd released his wrist and moved to the front door, looking back expectantly. "You want to go out? We just came back an hour ago." Shadow remained by the door, his posture communicating urgency rather than routine need. With considerable effort, James rose from his chair and followed his partner. As soon as he opened the door, Shadow headed not toward the yard, but to James's SUV, parked in the driveway. "You want to go for a drive? Now?" Shadow sat beside the passenger door, his intention unmistakable. Too tired to argue and trusting his partner's judgment, James retrieved his keys and opened the vehicle. Shadow immediately jumped into the passenger seat, not his usual place, in the specially modified rear compartment. "Where to?" James asked, settling behind the wheel with a grimace of pain. Shadow offered no guidance beyond his continued intensity, his gaze fixed forward through the windshield. With a bemused shake of his head, James started the engine and backed out of the driveway. He drove aimlessly at first, watching for any reaction from Shadow that might indicate a destination. When he turned onto the road leading toward the hospital, Shadow's posture relaxed slightly, as if approving the direction. The hospital? At this hour? It was nearly 8 p.m., well past their usual visiting time. "Still," James continued, curious about Shadow's unusual behavior. As they approached the medical center, Shadow became more animated, shifting in his seat and focusing intently on the building ahead. James parked in the visitor's lot, wondering if he was indulging canine whimsy or something more meaningful. "If security asks, this was your idea," he told Shadow as they entered through the main lobby. The evening receptionist recognized them immediately. "Sergeant Callahan, Shadow. We weren't expecting you tonight." "Unscheduled visit," James explained vaguely. "Is Dr. Keller still around? I believe he's doing evening rounds. Shall I page him?" James nodded, still following Shadow's lead as the dog moved purposefully toward the elevators. They rode to the oncology floor, where Shadow immediately headed down the corridor with determined focus. Dr. Keller met them halfway, surprise evident on his face. "James, Shadow, is everything all right? Are you experiencing new symptoms?" "I'm fine," James assured him. "Shadow insisted on coming here. I've learned to trust his judgment." The doctor's expression shifted to professional curiosity. "Interesting. Let's see where he wants to go." They followed Shadow as he navigated the hallway with confidence, passing several rooms before stopping abruptly outside room 412. The dog sat down, looking up at James with the familiar alert expression. "He's alerting," James confirmed, meeting Dr. Keller's gaze. "Strongly." Dr. Keller consulted the chart outside the door. "Mr. Victor Ramirez, 41, admitted yesterday with severe abdominal pain and jaundice, suspected gallstones or hepatitis." He frowned thoughtfully. "Gallbladder issues can sometimes present similarly to pancreatic cancer." "Should we go in?" James asked. "Let me speak with him first. Wait here." Dr. Keller entered the room, closing the door behind him. James could hear muffled conversation as the doctor presumably explained the situation to the patient. After several minutes, Dr. Keller reopened the door and motioned them inside. A middle-aged Hispanic man lay in the hospital bed, his complexion noticeably yellowed. He regarded Shadow with cautious interest. "Mr. Ramirez, this is Sergeant Callahan and his partner Shadow." Dr. Keller introduced them. I've explained our canine detection program. He's agreed to let Shadow examine him. James nodded respectfully to the patient. Shadow won't touch you unless invited. He'll just use his sense of smell. The doctor says your dog can smell cancer, Mr. Ramirez asked skeptically. Sounds like science fiction. I understand the skepticism, James replied. But Shadow has a pretty impressive track record. With a gesture from James, Shadow began his methodical examination, circling the bed and sniffing carefully. When he reached the right side of Mr. Ramirez's abdomen, he sat promptly, staring up at James. He's alerting to your upper right abdomen, James explained to the patient, whose skepticism had visibly diminished. Dr. Keller made notes on his tablet. I'll order additional imaging focused on the pancreas and surrounding tissues. An endoscopic ultrasound would give us the clearest picture. You really think it could be cancer? Mr. Ramirez asked, his voice tight with new fear. I just thought it was gallstones. Shadow's alerts warrant investigation, Dr. Keller said carefully. It doesn't guarantee a diagnosis, but it gives us reason to look more thoroughly. The good news is that if there is something there, we're likely catching it earlier than we might have otherwise. As they left the room, Dr. Keller regarded Shadow with renewed appreciation. His initiative is remarkable. He brought you here, specifically for this patient, a patient who wasn't even on our radar for potential malignancy. James nodded, leaning against the wall as a wave of fatigue washed over him. The unexpected excursion had drained his limited reserves. Are you all right? Dr. Keller asked, immediately shifting from researcher to physician. You look pale. Just tired, James admitted. It's been a long day. Let's get you home. I can call Sarah to pick you up. No need to worry her. I can drive. Dr. Keller looked unconvinced but didn't argue. I'll walk you to your car. And I'd like you to come in tomorrow, not for the program, but to check your pain management. I suspect we need to adjust your medication. The drive home was difficult, pain and fatigue making concentration a challenge. Shadow watched him intently from the passenger seat, as if monitoring his condition. When they finally arrived home, James found himself unable to make it past the living room couch, collapsing onto it, with Shadow immediately settling on the floor beside him. You did good tonight, partner, he murmured, his eyes already closing. Really good. The following morning, Sarah found them still there, James asleep on the couch, Shadow maintaining his vigil. She had let herself in when her father didn't answer her calls. Dad, she said gently, touching his shoulder. Dad, wake up. James opened his eyes slowly, momentarily disoriented. Sarah, what time is it? Almost 10. I've been calling you. He struggled to sit up, wincing at the stiffness in his joints. Sorry, forgot to charge my phone. Sarah's expression told him she wasn't fooled by the casual explanation. She saw the pain etched in his features, the increasing frailty that no amount of determined stoicism could hide. Dr. Keller called me this morning, she said, sitting beside him. Told me about last night. He's concerned about you. Shadow wanted to visit a patient, James explained, deliberately focusing on the positive aspect. Turns out the guy might have pancreatic cancer that was being misdiagnosed as gallbladder disease. That's amazing, Sarah acknowledged. But don't change the subject. Dr. Keller says you're pushing yourself too hard. The program can continue without you being physically present every session. James shook his head. Shadow works best with me. The researchers confirm it. His alert clarity is strongest when I'm the one handling him. Dad. Sarah's voice cracked slightly. You need to think about quality over quantity now. That's what Mom would have said. The mention of his late wife, Sarah's mother, who had died of breast cancer 12 years earlier, landed heavily. Catherine had chosen comfort care in her final months, focusing on meaningful time with family rather than aggressive treatments with minimal benefit. Your appointment with Dr. Keller is at 1 o'clock, Sarah continued more gently. I'm driving. You no arguments? James didn't have the energy to protest. As Sarah moved to the kitchen to make coffee, he rested his hand on Shadow's head, drawing comfort from his partner's steady presence. She's right, you know, he whispered to the dog. I'm not going to win this fight, but maybe that's not the point anymore. Shadow lifted his head, meeting James's gaze with that uncanny intelligence that sometimes made James wonder exactly how much the dog understood. Not the words, perhaps, but certainly the emotion behind them, the acceptance gradually replacing fear and denial. At the hospital that afternoon, Dr. Keller conducted a thorough examination before discussing medication adjustments. The conversation eventually turned to what James had been avoiding, transitioning to palliative care. The latest scans show significant progression despite treatment, Dr. Keller explained gently. Continuing with the current approach is unlikely to meaningfully extend your life, but it will certainly impact your quality of life negatively. James nodded, having expected this recommendation. What's your best estimate on timeline? Dr. Keller hesitated. It's always difficult to predict with precision, but based on the rate of progression, weeks rather than months. Perhaps 6 to 8 weeks. Sarah, sitting beside her father, reached for his hand. And the program? James asked. Shadow's work? The research continues regardless, Dr. Keller assured him. We've already secured funding for a full year with likely extension, based on the preliminary results. Shadow's abilities have been thoroughly documented, but his performance statistics are highest with me handling him, James pointed out. True, but we've been cross-training Officer Martinez as a secondary handler. Shadow responds well to her. Not quite the same accuracy rate, but still well above our expectations. James absorbed this information, feeling both relief that the program would continue and a strange sense of loss that it would do so without him. And Mr. Ramirez, the patient from last night, you were right to trust Shadow's judgment. Preliminary imaging shows a mass in the head of the pancreas. We're doing a biopsy tomorrow, but the gastroenterologist is fairly confident it's malignant. The good news is, it appears to be early stage and potentially resectable. Another life potentially saved, perhaps the last one James would witness. He felt Sarah squeeze his hand, understanding the bittersweet significance of the moment. The mayor's office called this morning. Dr. Keller continued, changing the subject. They've moved up the commendation ceremony to next Friday, given the circumstances. I hope that works for you. James nodded, grateful for the consideration. We'll be there. As they left the hospital, Shadow walking carefully at James's side, his pace slowed to accommodate his handler's increasingly labored steps, Sarah broached the subject they had both been avoiding. We should talk about arrangements. Dad for Shadow after... She couldn't complete the sentence. Already taken care of, James assured her. Chief Wilson and I discussed it months ago. The department will officially retire him. He'll come to live with you and the boys. Are you sure? We'd love to have him, of course, but won't he miss working? James smiled slightly, watching Shadow scan their surroundings with the alertness that had made him such an effective police dog. He'll have a new job, looking after you and the kids. Besides, the hospital has agreed that he can continue with the detection program as a special consultant. Dr. Morrison's term, not mine. Sarah managed a watery smile. Always have a plan, don't you, Dad? Tried and true, Callahan philosophy. He confirmed, easing himself into the passenger seat of her car. Know when to fight, know when to accept, but always have a plan. As they drove home, James gazed out the window at the town he had protected for more than 2 decades. He had always imagined his legacy would be measured in arrests made, crimes prevented, community safety ensured. Never had he anticipated that his most significant contribution might come at the end, through the remarkable abilities of the partner who had first saved his life and was now poised to save many more. Shadow sat alert in the back seat, watching the passing scenery with keen interest. For him, each day remained full of purpose, a new scent to investigate, a person to help, a job to complete with unwavering dedication. Good lesson there, James murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. Live each day like Shadow does, fully, present, fully committed, no matter how many or few may remain. The city council chambers had never been so crowded. Every seat was filled, with additional spectators standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway beyond. Local media had set up cameras at strategic locations, their reporters speaking in hushed voices about the unprecedented ceremony about to take place. James sat in the front row, dressed in his full-dress uniform, despite the discomfort it caused. His weakened body. Shadow sat perfectly at attention beside him, the German shepherd's coat brushed to a glossy sheen for the occasion. Sarah and her twin boys flanked them, the children unusually subdued, sensing the gravity of the event. Quite a turnout, Chief Wilson commented, taking the seat beside James. The mayor says they haven't seen the chambers this full since the flood relief debates of '98. James nodded, conserving his limited energy. The past week had been difficult as he transitioned to palliative care. The constant pain had diminished with the new medication regimen, but so had his strength and stamina. Simply getting dressed and traveling to City Hall had required careful planning and Sarah's patient assistance. "How are you holding up?" Chief Wilson asked quietly. "I'm here," James replied with a small smile. "That's what matters." At precisely 2 o'clock, Mayor Deborah Henderson called the special session to order. After brief opening remarks, she turned to the primary purpose of the gathering. "Today we honor an extraordinary partnership between man and animal," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed chamber. "A partnership that began in service to public safety and evolved into something none of us could have anticipated. A groundbreaking medical detection program that has already saved lives and promises to save many more." From his seat, James could see Mr. Pearson and his daughter Karen, Emma Roberts still wearing a colorful headscarf, and several other patients whose lives had been impacted by Shadow's remarkable abilities. Victor Ramirez was absent, still recovering, from surgery that had successfully removed his early-stage pancreatic tumor. Mayor Henderson continued, detailing the program's achievements. 34 confirmed cancer detections, including 7 cases where conventional testing had initially missed the disease. She cited the research collaboration with 2 major universities, the recently secured federal grant to expand the program nationally, and the upcoming presentation at the National Oncology Conference. "None of this would have been possible," she said, "without the extraordinary bond between Sergeant James Callahan and his K9 partner, Shadow." At the sound of his name, Shadow's ears perked up. but he maintained his perfect sitting position, the model of canine discipline. "Sergeant Callahan, would you and Shadow please come forward?" With Sarah's discreet assistance, James rose from his seat and walked slowly to the podium, Shadow keeping perfect pace beside him. The effort cost him dearly, but he was determined to complete this final official duty with the dignity his position demanded. Mayor Henderson presented a specially designed medallion attached to a ceremonial collar for Shadow and a matching commendation medal for James. "For distinguished service to the citizens of Millfield," she read from the inscription, "your partnership has transcended the boundaries of traditional public service and pioneered a new frontier in medical detection." The council chambers erupted in applause, many rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. Shadow, unfazed by the noise, remained focused on James, sensing his handler's fragility and staying close to his side. "Would you like to say a few words, Sergeant?" the mayor asked, gesturing to the microphone. James hadn't planned to speak, but looking out at the gathered crowd, fellow officers, medical personnel, patients whose lives Shadow had touched, he felt compelled to offer something. "Thank you for this honor," he began, his voice weaker than he would have liked, but still carrying the authority of his years in service. "When Shadow first alerted to my cancer, I thought it was just another example of the extraordinary bond between handlers and their canine partners. What I didn't realize was that it was the beginning of something much bigger than either of us." He paused, gathering strength to continue. "Shadow's abilities aren't unique in the canine world. Research has shown that many dogs have the potential to detect disease through scent. What makes our program special is the collaboration between law enforcement and medicine, between established institutions and new approaches. It reminds us that some of the most valuable innovations happen at the intersection of different fields." James rested his hand on Shadow's head. "This medal belongs to everyone who took a chance on an unusual idea. Dr. Keller and his team, Chief Wilson and the department, the patients who trusted a dog's nose alongside traditional medical testing. Shadow and I were just the bridge between worlds that needed to connect." Another round of applause followed his remarks, during which James felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He gripped the podium for support, hoping the momentary weakness wasn't visible to the audience. Chief Wilson immediately stepped forward. "Thank you, Sergeant Callahan and Shadow, for your exemplary service," she said smoothly, providing cover. As James regained his composure, "Your legacy will continue to shape both our department and our community's approach to public health." As James returned to his seat, leaning more heavily on Sarah than he would have liked, he caught Dr. Keller's concerned gaze from across the aisle. The doctor nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement of James's deteriorating condition and a gesture of respect for his determination to complete this milestone. The ceremony concluded with a video presentation highlighting Shadow's journey from conventional police dog to medical detection pioneer. James watched with a mixture of pride and poignancy as images of Shadow working in various settings flashed across the screen. Training exercises from his early days, drug busts from their years on patrol, and more recent footage of Shadow in hospital corridors, focused and purposeful in his new role. The final scene showed Shadow with a group of pediatric patients, each taking turns gently petting him, while a nurse explained his special abilities. The children's faces lit with wonder at the idea of a dog who could smell sickness and make it better, as one young boy described it. When the lights came up, Mayor Henderson announced a small reception in the adjacent community room for those who wished to congratulate Sergeant Callahan and Shadow personally. Before James could rise, Dr. Keller appeared beside him. "How are you really doing?" he asked quietly. "Running on fumes," James admitted. "But I'll make it through the reception." Dr. Keller looked skeptical but didn't argue. 20 minutes. No. More. Then straight home to rest. Doctor's orders. The reception line moved slowly as dozens of well-wishers stopped to shake James's hand, pat Shadow, and share personal stories of how the program had affected them. James remained seated, conserving his dwindling energy while Shadow stood vigilant beside him, occasionally accepting gentle scratches but maintaining his professional demeanor. Emma Roberts approached with her parents, her complexion noticeably healthier than during their garden encounter. "My last round of chemotherapy is scheduled for next week," she told James proudly. "The doctors are using words like complete remission and excellent prognosis. I just wanted to thank you both." "Again. Shadow did the hard part," James replied with a smile. "I'm just the translator." Emma knelt to Shadow's level, meeting his intelligent gaze. "The hospital says you'll still be visiting even when—" She glanced up at James, then back to Shadow. "I'll look for you on Tuesdays." After Emma moved on, Mr. Pearson and Karen stepped forward. The elderly man looked remarkably improved, with color in his cheeks and a steadiness to his movements that had been absent during their home visit. "My 6-month scan was clear," he reported, his gruff voice softened with emotion. "No sign of recurrence. Doctor says if it stays that way for 5 years, they'll use the word cured." Karen handed James a small package. "We wanted you to have this. It's not much, but it means a lot to our family." Inside the carefully wrapped box was a framed photograph of 3 generations of Pearsons: Gerald, Karen, and 2 teenagers who shared her features. On the frame was inscribed, "For the extra time we never thought we'd have. Thank you, James." And Shadow, James found himself momentarily unable to speak, overwhelmed by the tangible evidence of what Shadow's gift had made possible. Not just extended life, but extended connection, memories created that would otherwise have been lost. "Thank you," he managed finally. "This means more than you." "No." As the reception continued, James noticed Shadow becoming increasingly alert, his attention focused on something across the room. Following his partner's gaze, James spotted a middle-aged woman he didn't recognize, speaking with Dr. Morrison near the refreshment table. Shadow's behavior wasn't aggressive or alarmed, just intensely focused, the same expression he showed. When making a detection, James signaled to Sarah, who had been hovering nearby. "Shadow's interested in someone over there," he murmured. "The woman in the blue dress, talking to Dr. Morrison. Can you see who she is?" Sarah nodded and made her way, casually through the crowd. James watched as she joined the conversation, speaking briefly before returning. "That's Councilwoman Peterson's assistant," Sarah reported. "She came to represent the councilwoman, who couldn't attend. Her name is Diane Winters." James frowned, thoughtfully. Shadow's showing interest in her, not quite a full alert, but definitely focused. "Should we say something?" Sarah asked uncertainly. Before James could respond, Dr. Morrison noticed Shadow's attention and seemed to reach the same conclusion. The researcher excused herself from the conversation and approached James. "Shadow seems interested in Ms. Winters," she observed quietly. James nodded. Not a definitive alert, but significant focus. He keeps looking at her midsection. Dr. Morrison considered this information with professional neutrality. Would you be comfortable if I mentioned it to her? Delicately, of course. I could frame it as an invitation to participate in the program. That's probably best, James agreed. Coming from you, it's scientific. Coming from me, I understand, Dr. Morrison assured him. I'll handle it. As she returned to Ms. Winters, Chief Wilson appeared at James's side. Time to wrap this up, Callahan. You look like you're about to collapse. James didn't argue. The ceremonial occasion had drained his limited reserves, and even sitting was becoming an effort. He gestured to Sarah, who immediately began making discreet preparations for their departure. One moment, Chief Wilson said, turning back to address the gathering. Ladies and gentlemen, Sergeant Callahan and Shadow need to depart now. Please join me in one final round of applause to express our community's gratitude for their extraordinary service. The room filled with applause and a few calls of, "Thank you, Sergeant," and "Good boy, Shadow." James acknowledged the tribute with a nod, unable to stand for a final bow. Shadow, sensing it was time to leave, moved closer to James's chair in preparation for their exit. Sarah helped her father to his feet, supporting him discreetly as they made their way toward the side door where her car waited. Dr. Keller joined. Them concern evident in his professional assessment of James's condition. Straight home and into bed, the doctor instructed. I'll stop by this evening to check on you. James nodded, too exhausted to speak. The brief journey to the car seemed to stretch endlessly, each step requiring more concentration than the last. By the time Sarah helped him into the passenger seat, his shirt was damp with perspiration from the effort. Shadow jumped into the back seat without command, positioning himself directly behind James as if to continue his watchful supervision. The drive home passed in silence, James drifting in and out of awareness as fatigue and medication blurred the boundaries of consciousness. At home, the simple act of moving from car to bedroom became a monumental challenge. With Sarah's patient assistance, James managed to reach his bed, where he sank into the relief of horizontal rest. Shadow immediately settled on the floor beside him, maintaining his vigilant presence. "Do you need anything?" Sarah asked, adjusting his pillows and checking that water and medication were within reach. "Just rest," James murmured, already feeling sleep pulling at him. "You don't have to stay." "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah replied firmly, settling into the armchair near the window. "The boys are with Tom's parents until tomorrow. I've got nowhere else to be." As darkness closed in, James felt a peculiar sense of completion. The ceremony had provided formal recognition, a capstone to both his law enforcement career and Shadow's pioneering medical work. Whatever happened now, and he harbored no illusions about his rapidly declining condition, their legacy was secure. He woke sometime later to find Dr. Keller checking his vital signs, the bedroom lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Shadow remained at his post, alert despite the late hour. "How are we doing?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "You pushed yourself too hard today," Dr. Keller replied, though without reproach. "Your body needs time to recover." "Time is the one thing I'm short on," James observed with grim humor. Dr. Keller adjusted the medication drip that had been installed the previous week, ensuring continuous pain management. "I spoke with Ms. Winters after you left," he said, changing the subject, "explained about Shadow's interest and suggested she might want to schedule a checkup, just as a precaution." How did she take it? Better than you might expect. Turns out her mother died of ovarian cancer at relatively young age. She's been meaning to get screened, but keeping putting it off. Shadow's attention gave her the push she needed. James nodded, too tired for further conversation. Dr. Keller seemed to understand, completing his examination in silence before gathering his equipment. "Try to rest tomorrow," the doctor advised. "No visitors, except family. Your body needs to recover some strength." After he left, James drifted in the twilight between wakefulness and sleep, aware of Sarah dozing in the armchair and Shadow's steady presence beside the bed. There was comfort in being surrounded by those who cared, even as he felt himself slipping gradually away from them. The next few days passed in a blur of increasing weakness. James spent most of his time sleeping, waking for brief periods to take medication and receive visitors. Sarah and the boys, Chief Wilson, occasionally Dr. Keller or Dr. Morrison, with updates on the program. Shadow never left his side, abandoning his usual routines to maintain constant vigil. The German shepherd ate only when food was brought directly to the bedroom, and even then, he rushed through meals to resume his position beside James's bed. He accepted brief walks in the backyard with Sarah, but showed obvious anxiety until returning. To his handler, "He knows," James told Sarah one evening, watching Shadow's attentive monitoring. "He's known from the beginning." 1 week after the commendation ceremony, Dr. Morrison arrived with news that would have energized James in healthier days. The National Oncology Conference Committee has requested that Shadow attend in person, she reported, sitting beside his bed. "They want to conduct a live demonstration as part of our presentation." James nodded, acknowledging the honor while recognizing the implied timeline. The conference was still 6 weeks away. "Officer Martinez will handle him well," he said, his voice weaker than even the day before. "They've been training together." "Shadow has accepted her as a secondary handler," Dr. Morrison agreed. "His detection accuracy with her is approximately 88%. Not quite the 96% he achieves with you, but still remarkable." "He trusts her," James murmured. "That's the foundation." Dr. Morrison hesitated, then shared additional news. "Diane Winters, the woman from the ceremony, she followed up with her doctor as suggested. They found early-stage ovarian cancer, exactly where Shadow had focused his attention. The prognosis is excellent with immediate treatment." A ghost of a smile crossed James's pale features. "Another one for Shadow's record. Her case will be included in our conference presentation," Dr. Morrison confirmed. "It brings Shadow's total to 36 confirmed detections." After she left, James drifted into sleep again, waking hours later to find Sarah replacing the flowers on his bedside table with fresh arrangements. The room had gradually filled with bouquets, cards, and small gifts from well-wishers, fellow officers, hospital staff, patients whose lives had been touched by Shadow's abilities. "The boys want to come by after school," Sarah said, noticing he was awake. "Just for a little while, is that okay?" James nodded, grateful for the connection to normal life his grandsons represented. "Tell them to bring Shadow's red ball. He'd like to see it, even if he can't play right now." When 10-year-old twins Ryan and Dylan arrived, they approached the bed with uncharacteristic caution, their young faces solemn, with the understanding that their grandfather was very ill. "Hey, Grandpa," Ryan said, his voice small in the quiet. "Room. We brought Shadow's ball like you said." Shadow's ears immediately perked up at the sight of his favorite toy, though he didn't move from his position beside the bed. "He's being a good guard dog," Dylan observed, "watching over you." "The best," James agreed, summoning energy to engage with his grandsons. "Did you know Shadow was the top dog in his training class? Better than 15 other police dogs, the boys nodded, having heard the story many times, but never tiring of it. "Mom says he's going to come live with us," Ryan said hesitantly. When you get too sick." The direct approach, typical of children, was somehow easier to address than adults' careful avoidance of the topic. "That's right," James confirmed. "Shadow has a new job to do, looking after you two. Think you can help him with that?" Both boys nodded solemnly. "We'll walk him every day," Dylan promised, "and brush him, and make sure he has his special food." "He likes to sleep where he can see the door," James advised them, "and he needs his yellow duck toy at bedtime." This last detail, the dignified police dog's attachment to a squeaky rubber duck, brought smiles to both young faces, easing the heaviness of the moment. "Will he still go to the hospital to find cancer?" Ryan asked. "Yes," James assured them. "Officer Martinez will take him for his special hospital work, but the rest of the time he'll be with you." The visit continued with the boys sharing school stories and neighborhood news, their initial solemnity gradually giving way to more natural interaction. Shadow remained alert throughout, dividing his attention between the boys and James with the balanced focus that had made him such an exceptional working dog. As they prepared to leave, Dylan approached Shadow and solemnly placed the red ball beside him. "You can keep it here until Grandpa feels better," he said, petting the dog's head with gentle affection. Dr. Morrison's prediction proved accurate. Over the next 5 years, the Callahan Shadow Protocol transformed cancer detection nationwide. What had begun with one remarkable German Shepherd expanded to include 47 specially trained dogs working across 23 hospitals, with results that revolutionized early detection rates for multiple cancer types. Sarah's surgery had been successful, with follow-up screenings showing no recurrence. Her experience became part of the program's narrative, not just a handler's. Daughter saved by his dog, but evidence of Shadow's continuing evolution. His detection abilities seemed to have sharpened rather than diminished with time, defying expectations about working dogs' effectiveness as they aged. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah sat in the audience at Millfield Memorial Hospital's newly constructed Callahan Center for Integrative Medicine. The state-of-the-art facility housed both traditional cancer screening technology and a dedicated canine detection unit where patients could receive dual screening approaches. Shadow, now 12 years old with distinguished gray around his muzzle, lay at her feet as Dr. Keller addressed the gathering. 5 years ago, we couldn't have imagined where this journey would lead, he said, gesturing to the statistical displays behind him. The Callahan Shadow Protocol has been implemented in 17 states and 4 countries. Detection rates have improved by 37% for pancreatic cancer, 42% for ovarian cancer, and 28% for thyroid malignancies, all cancers that traditionally elude early screening. In the front row sat Ryan and Dylan, now teenagers, listening with evident pride. Between them, a 2-year-old German Shepherd named Scout watched the proceedings with the same focused intensity that had characterized Shadow in his prime. "Today, we're announcing the next phase," Dr. Keller continued, Our first graduating class of second-generation detection dogs, trained using methods refined directly from Shadow's pioneering work. A side door opened and Officer Martinez entered, with 6 handler dog teams lined up behind her. The dogs, a mix of German Shepherds, Labrador Retrievers and Border Collies, moved with disciplined precision to their designated positions on stage. These teams will deploy to regional hospitals throughout the Midwest, Dr. Morrison explained, joining Dr. Keller at the podium, each representing the continuation of Sergeant Callahan's vision that the extraordinary bond between humans and dogs could transform medical detection. Shadow watched the younger dogs with attentive dignity, seemingly understanding his role as the progenitor of their mission. When the ceremony concluded, he rose stiffly, his once fluid movements now measured with age, and approached Scout, who had completed training just months earlier. The 2 German Shepherds regarded each other, a symbolic passing of the torch. Scout had been specifically selected from a litter of exceptional working dogs to become Shadow's successor in the Millfield program. Though he lived with Officer Martinez, he spent weekends with Sarah's family, allowing Shadow to guide his development both professionally and as a family protector. Emma Roberts, now a medical student inspired by her experience with Shadow, approached Sarah as the crowd dispersed. "I'm still amazed when I think about it," she said, kneeling to greet Shadow with the affection of a long-time friend. "If your dad and Shadow hadn't pioneered this program, my leukemia might not have been caught until it was too late. Now I'm studying oncology myself, hoping to work with the canine detection teams after graduation." "Dad would have loved that," Sarah replied, watching as Emma's attention shifted to Scout, who observed their interaction with professional interest. "Is he officially taking over soon?" Emma asked, noting the younger dog's alert posture. Sarah nodded, emotion briefly tightening her throat. "Shadow's retiring next month. His hips are bothering him more, though he won't admit it. Scout's been handling most of the hospital sessions already." The transition had been gradual and carefully managed, with Shadow initially overseeing Scout's hospital interactions as if supervising a student. The older dog seemed to understand his protégé needed experience, while Shadow could still provide guidance. Later that evening, as Sarah relaxed at home with the family gathered in the living room, Shadow moved from his customary place by the fireplace to sit beside the framed photograph of James in his dress uniform. "He does that sometimes," Ryan observed quietly, "like he's checking in." Sarah nodded, understanding the profound connection that continued even years after her father's passing. They had something special. Shadow returned to settle between the boys, who automatically made space for him on the couch, a privilege earned in retirement that would have been unthinkable during his working years. Scout lay nearby on his designated bed, watching Shadow with the attentiveness of a student observing a revered master. "Over 300 people," Dylan said suddenly, reviewing the program from the day's ceremony. "That's how many lives Shadow has directly helped save with his detections, and thousands more through the program he started." Sarah considered this remarkable legacy, from one unusual alert that had revealed her father's cancer too late to save him, but just in time to launch a program that would save countless others, including herself. The numbers couldn't capture the full impact. Families kept intact, children who still had parents, grandparents who lived to meet their grandchildren. Dad always said Shadow's real gift wasn't his nose, but his heart, Sarah reflected. His ability to form connections that transcended what we thought possible between species. As if acknowledging this assessment, Shadow raised his head slightly, his intelligent eyes holding the same depth of understanding they had shown when he first alerted to James's cancer nearly 6 years earlier. The following week, media crews arrived at Millfield Memorial for a special broadcast highlighting the Callahan Shadow Protocol's success. Sarah had agreed to participate, bringing both Shadow and Scout to demonstrate the program's evolution. We're here with Sarah Callahan Martinez, daughter of the late Sergeant James Callahan, who, along with his canine partner Shadow, pioneered what has become one of the most significant advancements in early cancer detection in decades, the reporter began, camera focused on Sarah with Shadow and Scout sitting perfectly at attention beside her. Shadow's extraordinary abilities first manifested when he detected his handler's cancer, Sarah explained. While my father's cancer was already advanced, their partnership created something remarkable, a legacy that continues to expand and save lives daily. The segment concluded with Shadow performing one final demonstration, flawlessly detecting a training sample, while Scout observed, ready to continue the mission that would outlast both the original partners who had started it all. As the cameras stopped rolling, Sarah knelt beside Shadow, the aging German shepherd who had changed everything. "Good boy," she whispered, the simple praise encompassing far more than just the day's performance. Shadow leaned slightly against her, his steady presence a reminder that some connections never truly end. They simply transform and expand in ways we might never have imagined. Incredible, isn't it? Our bond between a police officer and his canine partner could transform into something that revolutionized cancer detection and saved hundreds of lives. Shadow's remarkable ability to detect cancer before medical tests could find it reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary breakthroughs come from unexpected places. What do you think about this amazing story? Could animals like Shadow hold the key to earlier cancer detection? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched you, please consider hitting that subscribe button. We bring you extraordinary real-life stories every week about the incredible bonds between humans and animals that change lives in unexpected ways. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you won't miss our next video. The military dog who rescued an entire village during Hurricane Florence, an unbelievable act of heroism. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most extraordinary heroes have 4 legs and a tail. Thanks for watching.